I call this meeting to order. So welcome everyone once again. So I welcome you all to meeting number 53 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security. We will start by acknowledging that we are meeting on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin people. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the House Order of November 25th, 2021. Members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. Pursuant to the order of reference of Thursday, June 23rd, 2022, the committee resumes consideration of Bill C-21, an act to amend certain acts and to make certain consequential amendments firearms. The committee is resuming clause-by-clause consideration. Before we resume debate, I will now welcome once again our officials who are with us today. We have from the Department of Justice, we have Paula Clark, Counsel, Criminal Law, Policy Section. Phaedra Gushek, Counsel, Criminal Law, Policy Section. From the Department of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness, we have Rachel Mainville-Dale, Acting Director General, Firearms Policy. From the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, we have Rob Daly, Director, Strategic Policy, Canadian Firearms Program. Murray Smith, Technical Specialist, Canadian Firearms Program. These names are starting to roll off my tongue very easily. Practice makes perfect. So thank you for joining us today once again, and your participation is very important for the committee members. So we are resuming debate on Amendment G4. At the time of adjournment, Mr. Nur Mohammed had the floor, and he will continue. Following Mr. Nur Mohammed, we will have Ms. Dancho, followed by Ms. Damoff, and there's a whole other long list coming. So we'll start there. Mr. Nur Mohammed, if you please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank our officials for coming back. And before I pick up where we left off, bless you. Before I pick up where we left off last night, I just wanted to take a minute to kind of set the stage a little bit. Look, I think, as I said last time, all of us are keen to put forward measures to make our community safe. I don't think there's any disagreement about that. I think there are different perspectives. We've made very clear there are different perspectives on how to approach the topic of gun safety and gun violence and getting guns off our streets. And we've all heard from our constituents. We've all heard from folks that are not our constituents. We've heard from Canadians in general. And I have stated, as have my colleagues on this committee, as has the Prime Minister, that there is a willingness, a desire, an openness, and an intention to make sure this is the best possible legislation that it can be, and that we take the time and we hear the voices of folks that have either who have either not had clarity as to what this bill contains or have concerns about what this bill does contain. And part of what I am hoping we can accomplish today with our witnesses is to get some clarity around areas of concern and to, frankly, try to break down some of the myths that may exist around this bill. And if we are speaking candidly, that we should also find areas where there could be potential room for opportunity. And I think this is something that we would all, I think from which we would all benefit. And I think all Canadians would benefit. And so there's been a lot of work that has gone on to try and do that, but we can always do more. And so, look, I think we've all been very, very clear that Canadians deserve to feel safe in their communities, but that we also need to respect hunters, other law-abiding gun owners, farmers that use appropriate guns to protect livestock, to protect their farms, and, of course, Indigenous communities. And as we take the time to clarify any misinformation regarding the amendment that was presented at this committee on November 22nd, I want to make sure we do whatever we can, and we are all committed to taking down the temperature wherever we can, to listen to whatever perspectives are out there, and to have a healthy discussion based on facts. Aujourd'hui, les membres comité.
Today, the Liberal members of the Standing Committee on Public Safety together with the Bloc and the NDP, have asked for 2 emergency meetings. I want to thank our colleague from the Bloc for this idea. Quite frankly, the idea of working together is something that we have to do here. On behalf of my colleagues, I want to thank Christine for having put forward this motion. This allowed us to have more witnesses and hear other experts.
This will hopefully allow us to hear from witnesses, to address any of the outstanding issues that exist, to improve the law where the proposed law where appropriate, and to give Canadians the confidence that their government is listening, and to give opposition and other parties the opportunity to ensure that we are doing our part together to do what was intended in this bill, which was to ban assault-style weapons,
Point of order, Mr.
not
Chair.
those
Point of
commonly
order.
used for hunting.
Stench, you want a point of order?
Mr. Nur Mohammed is mentioning 2 additional meetings for witness testimony. I'm not clear what he's talking about. We have not agreed to 2 meetings.
There has been a 1064 distributed.
Has it been agreed to?
The 1064 it compels the chair
Right,
to
but has
call
it
a
been
meeting.
discussed as a committee, sir?
I'm sorry?
Has it been discussed as a committee, sir? He's talking about as if this is established.
He can talk about it in whatever manner he likes.
Okay.
It's public information that the meeting to discuss that has been requested, and
Right, but just to be clear, it has not been agreed to as a committee that we would have only 2 additional meetings of witness testimony external to the witnesses we have here today. Is that correct? That has not been agreed to?
that's correct. That's
Okay.
the subject, will be the subject of the 1064 meeting.
Well, just to clarify, that is certainly my hope that we can do that. Look, we'll get there where the goal. Let me be clear about what the goal is. The goal is for us to have the time to hear from witnesses. The goal is for us to do that in an efficient manner, not to hold up good legislation, but to improve it, and to do it in a way. I know that it may seem funny to others on the other side, but it's an important piece of legislation, and we need to do our part. And if the effort to hear from other witnesses is something that others wish to partake in, I think that's an important step. I know others have been asking for it, and we hope that this step will take us to that place. We want to make sure that we work collaboratively to make sure that there are no guns that are commonly used for hunting captured within these proposed amendments. We're listening to Canadians, and we're going to get this right. I have been saying that. My colleagues have been saying that since the beginning of this. And again, we may have different approaches, but I think the intention is the same. So with that said, I would like to try and do a little bit of what we were doing last time, which is to just get some clarity for folks out there that are watching this and have been bombarded by messages that the government is coming, that I believe there was some narrative out there that the Bloc, the NDP, and the Liberals are coming for every single hunting rifle and shotgun out there, and we've made it clear time and again that we are not. That is not the intention. We've all spent time discussing these amendments, this amendment with our friends, with our families, in this committee, with constituents. I have heard from my constituents who have said that it is very important for them to make sure that we get this right so that we don't lose the opportunity to make once-in-a-generation advances in protecting Canadians. We've heard from farmers who have expressed concerns that they have not been able to they've not had the opportunity to understand whether or not the guns that they have would indeed be affected. We've also heard from extreme views who have chosen to turn this into a culture war, bringing racism, bringing misogyny, bringing all kinds of other vitriol and hate into this conversation. And the emails that some of them send are a reminder of why some people, frankly, should not have firearms. But it does not mean that they represent the vast, vast majority of gun owners in this country, and I want to make that very clear. And I think that those that choose to use racism and misogyny and, calls to violence and these types of tropes actually do not advance the cause that many people who have reached out to us with good intentions and goodwill seek to do. And as I said last week, I think it's really important for everyone on this committee, regardless of their political party, to denounce those views, to denounce the misogyny, the racism, the hate that has come from a lot of folks on the extreme right who are using using the work of others to be able to carry legal firearms as to promote some other sort of rhetoric of hate. And so I hope that we'll all be able to do that together. We have heard from folks who have expressed real concerns about the content and the context. And so what I'd like to be able to do is we've been asking a lot of very specific, very technical questions about specific makes and models. And so today, Mr. Smith, if I can, I would like us to try and break down the complex concepts to make sure we all understand the very foundation of what it is that we're proposing. So while we can answer the highly technical questions, we could also break down, and I hope you can help us with this, the technical concepts and make them digestible for average Canadians who might not know as much about hunting or shooting or firearms generally. So with that in mind, perhaps we can establish a few key principles. What are the range of firearms that are available in Canada for purchase?
I presume you mean purchased by individuals.
By individuals, yes.
And in that case, the kinds of firearms that are available for purchase include rifles, shotguns, carbines, handguns. Those are the broad categories. There are some specialty firearms as well that would be available to members of the public.
Okay. And how many makes and models does that involve or entail?
I don't think anyone really knows the answer to that. The firearms reference table has over 200,000 makes and models listed, so it's at least that many, and we're sure there are more, but no one really knows how many for sure.
So, sorry, just to be clear, at least 200,000 makes and models that are not captured by that are available for purchase.
Oh, okay. That's a slightly different question. And the firearms are categorized by whether they are prohibited, restricted, or non-restricted. If you look at all possible combinations of firearms, you wind up with something just over 200,000 specific types. Now that breaks it right down to caliber, barrel length, and magazine capacity. You can also look at it from a higher level and look at it from the standpoint of makes and models, which is the way it's organized in the schedules. And that gives you a smaller number because the make and model would include many firearms that have different barrel lengths and different magazine capacities and so on. So in that case, if you look at it from the standpoint of makes and models, there's something on the order of 25,000 makes and models that have been manufactured over the years.
So 20 makes and models, approximately over 200,000 individuals on the table.
To avoid confusion, it depends on how you divide the pie here, because there's around 25,000 makes and models, but those makes and models can be broken down into further subcategories based on the barrel length. So a model might be available in 2 barrel lengths, for example, or it might be available in 2 calibers or more. And so looking at it from a higher level standpoint on makes and models, around 25,000. If you look at it from the standpoint of the number of combinations possible of make and model and barrel length and caliber and so on, then it's over 200,000. But that includes all categories.
That includes all categories. And would you know, just for sort of a reference point, what that stat would look like for, say, the UK or Australia?
Well, the firearms reference table is international in scope, so it represents all firearms as best we can catalog made anywhere on the planet. So the list of firearms is going to be the same no matter what nation you're in. So you referred to, and others have referred to, the firearms registry table. Can you describe to us what that actually is? Yes, it's a database that was created by the RCMP to catalog firearms with 3 purposes in mind. One was to assist or this is the original purpose of the firearms reference table, was to assist police and officials involved in the firearms administration programs to identify firearms. That was point one. Point two was to create a standardized description of firearms, because for some firearms there's more than one way to describe it. They can have nicknames, and so this was to create a standardized way of referring to a firearm. And then thirdly, to assess the classification of the firearm according to the Canadian Criminal Code matrix. And that database was there to serve three purposes. One, to assist police and officials in identifying firearms. Secondly, the standardized description was there to assist with the population of tracing requests, based on the notion that if you don't properly describe the firearm, you're not likely to get a result out of a data system. So the purpose of creating a standardized description was to improve the chances of getting a hit if a firearm involved in crime was being traced. And then the third was to assist police with the determination of classification, and also officials engaged in the firearms program to determine the classification of a firearm so that the appropriate controls can be applied.
So if we were to specifically talk about this RCMP, how would the RCMP use this table?
The table is used administratively. It is not a legal document. The firearms reference table is not the law. The law resides in the criminal code. The firearms reference table represents the RCMP opinion on what the firearm should be named and what its classification is according to the current rules in the criminal code. And it is used throughout the RCMP and other police forces across Canada. They use it to identify firearms, so that if a firearm is seized by a police officer, the firearm can be properly identified and recorded in the police data system. It assists the courts, because if the firearm description is standardized, then the description remains the same as the firearm goes through the court system, and you don't wind up with continuity problems or other legal issues in court. It's used by administrators in the firearms program to ensure the firearm is properly described and that they are applying the appropriate administrative rules to the firearm. The classification portion is used likewise by police and officials to ensure that, in the case of policing, it assists with the laying of the appropriate charge. It assists with the determination of whether an offense has actually occurred or not. On the administrative side, it's the classification is necessary in order to apply the Firearms Act controls, so to ensure that the possessor has the correct firearms license with the correct conditions, that those firearms, some firearms need to be registered, and so that this is a way of identifying which firearms need to be registered as well.
Thank you. And I'm sure that there are people at home who are watching this riveted by this conversation, but there are a lot of folks who need to be able to understand some of what is going on here. And you've used the term classification a few times now. Can you explain what are the classifications of firearms that people should know about?
The criminal code has three classifications for firearms: prohibited, restricted, and non-restricted. You will also hear two other categories which, strictly speaking, are not classifications but are widely used as if they were, and that is antique firearm or deemed non-firearm. It's like an industrial tool, for example. And the firearms reference table is organized along those lines to represent those categories.
And how do agencies like CBSA use this list in order to make determinations of what is or isn't allowed, or should not be allowed in Canada?
Well, the determination as to what is allowed to be imported into Canada is, I believe, shared by officials at Global Affairs Canada and the Canada Border Services Agency. It's their role to determine what crosses the border. Both those agencies use the firearms reference table to assist them in their decision-making processes.
Who helps to review these classifications?
I'm not sure what you mean by that question, sir.
So as the classifications are made, who is there a continuous process of review? Is it static? How do the classifications work?
The firearms reference table is continuously reviewed and updated as the staff who build the firearms reference table become aware of new firearms. They're added to the firearms reference table. If there are new variations of existing models, those are added. If it turns out that there is some kind of information missing or erroneous in an FRT record and that becomes known, then there's a process for ensuring that it is corrected. The firearms reference table process is very much akin to the ISO process, even though it's not ISO certified, but it follows a similar process in that one researcher will be responsible for collecting the information to either create or update an FRT record concerning a particular firearm. And then a second independent quality assurance analyst will review that information to ensure that it's accurate and complete before the record is actually published.
Got it. But you mentioned that it was not a legal document per se, but it's used by everyone. So on what authority does it have, where does it get its legal weight from? On what authority are people using this document?
The authority for the firearms reference table comes from the RCMP Act, and it's simply a process that the RCMP has put in place to assist RCMP operations, and that was later expanded to assist other police departments and officials in other departments. But fundamentally, it's simply a police database that was originally developed for police use.
At the last meeting, we spent a lot of time, and you were very helpful in explaining to committee, the paragraphs 1 through 86 had firearms that were prohibited during the 1990s. So now, just for clarity's sake, because there's been a lot of confusion about this, how many different makes and models have been prohibited in Canada since the 1990s?
I'm again inferring you mean by regulations, and after the 1990s, the next round of prohibitions occurred in May of 2020, where the 9 families of assault style firearms were added to the regulations, and the 2 categories were added to the regulations. Those firearms which produced muzzle energies greater than 10,000 joules, and those firearms which had bore diameters in excess of 20 millimeter.
If I may.
But again, for sake of clarity, what is the number? How many were prohibited in the May 2020 order in council, and how many predated that?
So with respect to unique makes and models, there's approximately 800 in the 1990s through the regulations. As of May 1st, 2020, approximately 1,900 makes and models.
1,900 makes and models. Okay. Sorry? 1,900. So just to be clear, 800 that were 800 from the 1990s, and then a further 1,100 or a further 1,900?
Further
1,900. And that would then capture, just for clarity's sake, that would capture everything that has happened since the 1990s, new makes and models, et cetera, that would not have been contemplated in the 1990s because they didn't exist. Is that correct?
Yes. I think if I'm understanding your question correctly, yes. So as of today, there's approximately 800 makes and models that were covered by or prohibited by the 1990 regulations. And then there's an additional 1,019 that have now become prohibited based on the May 1st prohibition.
Okay. So how many firearms on Schedule 2? I was doing the math in my head. So the list in Schedule 2 that are not part of the 1990s prohibition, that's 1,900. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Got it. So what test would have been applied to get these ones added to the list in May 2020? Like, how would they have been added?
They would have been added based on the criteria that was used for May 1st. So they would have all have been semi-auto, sustained rapid fire, military tactical design, capable of receiving a large capacity magazine. They would also have been modern design, meaning post-World War II. And there would have been a prevalence or a market volume test of in excess of 1,000 known firearms within the market at the time. So it would have met all three of those criteria in order to be added to the list of the 1,900 makes and models.
Can you recap the three criteria? Sorry.
The criteria again are semi-auto, sustained rapid fire, military tactical design, capable of receiving a large capacity magazine, modern design in the sense of post-World War II, and prevalence in the market in excess of 1,000 firearms, known firearms.
Got it. Okay. So in sum, these would be guns that most reasonable people should not really be using for common use, I would imagine.
I can just say those are the guns that met
Okay.
all of those criteria.
Got it. Okay. Going back to the table for a second, whether it's Mr. Smith or Mr. Daly, is the table publicly accessible?
It's accessible certainly to all the police and government agencies by a direct connection on the internet. It's also available to the public via a PDF document that is posted, I believe, every 2 weeks these days.
Every 2 weeks. Okay.
That's not the easiest document to access, and the RCMP is presently working on an improved system to deliver to the public.
Let me tell you why I asked this question. We have all, I'm going to speak for everybody here, and correct me if I'm wrong. I think we have all received emails, text messages, phone calls about people asking a specific question: is my gun prohibited or not? The gun that I've had for however many years. Many of these, upon our research, have been were captured in previous iterations. How do people look these up to make sure that they don't have to reach out to their MPs or be upset and worry? How can they get confirmation that they're okay or not?
Well, the firearms reference table is in use today, and thus it must represent the law as it exists today. So there is no future or forward-looking aspect to the firearms reference table because it is and must be based on the current legislation.
But Mr. Smith, my question is not so much forward-looking, but we've been getting requests about guns that are on past lists. But there's no way for people to know, right? So I guess the question is, how do we make it possible? I guess there's two things, right? One is there is the need to assuage people of concerns that their gun, past, present, or future, is not going to be affected, which I think is one element. But there's a second element of people not having awareness about whether or not something was already covered previously. And I think the concern is, how do we make sure that we aren't conflating everything that has happened in this bill and in the amendment as being all net new? I guess what I'm trying to understand is, for a lot of us, the very detailed lists that were provided in the amendment can be confusing, because we see something and we think that it's net new when in fact it's been on the list for quite some time, or we see something and we don't see the word "except" at the top of the chapeau. So how do we give people the means, and I'd asked for the list last meeting, how do we give the means to people by which to be able to sift through this and understand where they sit on the continuum?
Frankly, that's something that's beyond my control. My understanding is the lists are now public. They've been released by the chair, I believe, so people can peruse the lists themselves. They are relatively lengthy. What I can say is in my interactions with members of the public over the classification of firearms, they generally find favor with the concept of firearms being listed explicitly in lists, because they can look it up and see it in black and white, as opposed to having to interpret a statute. That isn't to say that everyone's in favor of that, but that's generally what I've heard. And I guess the lists that are here are rather lengthy and probably requires a bit more effort than in the past to go through it.
With that in mind, Ms. Clark, do we have the list that I'd asked for?
So it has been prepared. It is just being vetted through our approval
Do we-
process to be able
Thank
to be
you.
forwarded to the committee.
I know it's a lot of work, so
Oh,
thank you
geez.
for doing that. When do you think we will have the benefit of that list?
I'm hoping today.
Like today? Okay, excellent. Excellent. I think that will hopefully, go a long way. And is there any intention or desire or plan to create a searchable database for Canadians?
So in terms of the list, the 480 new makes and models, not the 1,900 that were banned in 2020 and the 800 that were banned in the 90s, those ones presumably would be added and published, if passed, with the regulations as it is now in the Consolidated Martins Criminal Code or online on the Justice website. With respect to the definition, there is no list that would be supporting the definition in paragraph G. If it were to pass, there would be no list at this point. The legislation doesn't provide for a list to be set out, setting those
Right.
firearms.
Yeah, no, understood. Okay, so just going back to what you said, there are 2,700 firearms that were on the 1990s list and the 2020 list.
That's make and models.
Make and models,
So
right.
it's not firearms, it's
The
the
make
make
and
and
models,
models.
excuse me, make and models. And the new list is 480 makes and models.
Makes and models, correct.
Okay, so it's not, let me do my math quickly, it's not 3,180 new makes and models that are being added to the list.
Correct. It's only 480
Only
approximately.
480 approximately.
And
okay.
that includes the variants. So
That includes variants. So if you were to distill this down further, so specific and then variant A, B, C, D, if you were to say class, within each of those brand types, not variants, what does that number actually look like?
80
480,
Makes
but
and
that
models.
you're saying that includes variants.
includes variants.
Okay.
Yes, and so I think the word you're searching for is families. We refer
Thank
to
you.
them as
Yes,
families of
family,
firearms.
Yes.
And in the new list, in the Schedule 2, it would be those firearms in paragraphs 97 to 232. I don't have a calculator to do the subtraction, but that would be the number of new families listed.
Thank you. So you talked a little bit about the classification system. A firearm can be non-restricted, restricted, or prohibited. What does non-restricted mean to the average person?
The firearms classifications affect how an individual can use the firearm and whether or not the individual can actually possess the firearm. So in the case of non-restricted firearms, which is the least regulated classification of firearms, what it means to the average firearms owner is that they must obtain a possession and acquisition firearms license at the least level, the non-restricted firearms license, which is commonly referred to as a non-restricted PAL, or PAL meaning possession and acquisition license. And that entitles the individual to acquire a non-restricted firearm and to possess it, providing that license is continuously maintained. And thereafter, the individual is free to use the firearms in any way that is permitted by law.
What would be an example of a commonly used non-restricted firearm?
A typical hunting rifle would be, say, a bolt-action rifle, like, say, a Remington Model 700 or something of that ilk. There are something like close to 20,000 families of those kinds of firearms available to choose from, and you really can't categorize that breadth of firearms makes and models with a couple of examples. It's
So
a
let's
very
talk about
wide range.
Fair point. Let's talk about restricted then. What does that mean? I'm assuming that you need a restricted PAL for that and RPAL for that, but what does that mean?
Well, if a firearm is restricted, what it means to the individual is they must obtain the higher level firearms license, the restricted possession and acquisition license, or RPAL, as you indicated. It also means that the firearm itself would need to be registered with the Canadian Firearms Program Firearms Registry. And thirdly, if you wished to use that firearm for any lawful purpose, you would require an authorization to transport, in most cases, for that purpose. There are some exceptions. There are automatic authorizations to transport for regular uses like going to the range, but broadly speaking, you have to have an authorization to move a restricted firearm from your home to use it.
So why would I need?
Mr. Chair, point of clarification, please.
Mr. Ruff, on a point of clarification, go
Yeah,
ahead.
just with Mr. Talib's question, or I said Talib, not Mr. Mohammed's question to Mr. Smith, another element of that as well, any restricted firearms owners are run through the police database every 24 hours, correct?
I believe what you're referring to is called the FIP system, Firearms Interest Police, is what that decodes to. That's a system in place. And has been since the Firearms Act came into force in the 1990s, where if there is a police incident which matches certain criteria, usually crimes related to violence, then any names in the police investigation associated with that particular criminal investigation are flagged with what's called a FIP hit. That goes to the chief firearms officers for review where a FIP hit has occurred on a person who also has a firearms license. So the checking process that you're referring to, it does not take place every day for every firearms owner. Rather, it only occurs when a firearms owner is somehow connected to a serious police investigation. Not necessarily as a criminal, it could be some other element of it, but the individual firearms owner is connected to a police investigation serious enough that it is flagged and goes to the chief firearms officer for review of the license. So that's what that's all about.
Thank you, Mr. Ruff.
If I may,
Miss-
just to clarify, so quick
Sure, go
answer,
ahead.
yes, it does apply to individuals with possession and acquisition license with restricted privileges. It also, though, applies to people who have possession and acquisition licenses. So it's both. It's not just exclusive. So anybody who has a firearms license is run through those same processes. Okay, thank you.
Just
Thank
to
you,
this.
Mr. Ruff. And go ahead,
Thank
Mr.
you.
Nur Mohammed.
Now, just to clarify, though, this depends on the police department doing that, correct? This is not. Is it done universally, or does it depend on on whether or not a particular police department, or police force decides they're going to do that?
It's done universally. It's the program is run by Statistics Canada, and it's part of the obligatory reporting process for police agencies. I believe the nickname for it is UCR, Uniform Crime Reporting, and that's the StatsCan program, and it's mandatory for police.
So, why would I want an RPAL? Why would for what purpose would an average Canadian need an RPAL?
Well, an individual would need an RPAL if they choose to acquire a restricted firearm. They fall, broadly speaking, into two categories. One is handguns, and the other is restricted long guns, so rifles and shotguns, which happen to be restricted. And the individuals will generally acquire those for the purposes of target practice, but there are other reasons. So, for example, someone whose employment depends on a firearm will have to get the RPAL in order to use the firearm in the course of their employment. There are a number of possibilities all laid out in the Firearms Act. Those are the two most common.
And now, what about prohibited? What is a prohibited firearm, what does that mean? What does that look like in terms of a Canadian's ability to obtain? What is a prohibited firearm in this context?
Again, as far as individuals are concerned, a prohibited firearm is a firearm they cannot possess. They're forbidden to possess. There are some exceptions. There were firearms prohibited in the 1990s which were grandfathered to the owners, even though they're prohibited firearms, and those owners, but only those owners, can continue to possess them. But for the average Canadian today, a prohibited firearm is inaccessible. They're not allowed to have it for any reason.
So talk a little bit about the grandfathering. What does that actually mean for someone who has one?
Grandfathering was a process that was last used in the 1990s, and it is a process whereby an individual who is in lawful possession of a firearm prior to it becoming prohibited, and presuming the individual meets all the terms and conditions, is granted a license to allow that individual to continue to possess one or more of those firearms.
And what determines how each of these weapons falls into each of these categories?
I'm sorry that you faded out. I didn't hear
So
that.
what determines how each of these weapons falls into each of these categories?
That's a choice by either Parliament or Governor and Council. They are the decision makers in those cases.
So from those that are commonly available, what type of firearms can be used for hunting? I mean, it's a vague question, but for the purposes of hunting, what would you, as an expert in this field, say which type would be commonly used within the classification sphere? In
Canada, nearly all hunting is carried out with rifles and shotguns. The kind of firearm that can be used for hunting is regulated by provincial hunting regulations for the most part. There is a federal component to the regulation as well for the federal Migratory Game Birds Act, covers ducks and geese and certain other migratory game. But for the most part, the kinds of firearms that a hunter is allowed to use are determined by the provincial hunting regulations in concert with the provisions of the Firearms Act, which limit hunting to the use of non-restricted firearms.
For clarity's sake, then the vast majority of rifles and shotguns that are used for hunting would fall into the non-restricted category. Is that correct?
Well, based on the laws that are in force in Canada now at both the federal and the provincial level, my understanding is that those laws would preclude the use of any firearm other than a non-restricted firearm for hunting.
So this then would not. So then, I mean, it's a philosophical question. So I'm not going to ask it of you, but it seems to me as you're talking that when we're talking about rifles and shotguns, people that are using rifles and shotguns that are non-restricted don't have much to worry about.
Well, what I can say, and trying to avoid philosophical questions, is that the firearms that are affected by the proposal that's before the committee would become prohibited, and then by law those firearms would be inaccessible for hunting.
Right.
But as for whether that's a good idea or a bad idea, that falls to you and your colleagues.
Right. So let's now talk about C21 and this amendment and classifications. How would these classifications change on the basis of C21 or the proposed amendment?
Well, the provisions that affect firearms classification fall into two broad categories. The schedules are being created, or proposed rather, which would continue the existing prohibitions from the 1990s and 2020, as well as add new ones. Those are the ones at the end of Schedule 2, from paragraphs 97 onwards. So there'd be more firearms prohibited by the action of the schedules if those were adopted. The second broad matter that would change classifications is the so-called evergreening definition, which would automatically put firearms into the prohibited category if they met the criteria that was specified in that particular proposed amendment.
So now, just going back to this question of classifications, and the conversation that we had had earlier, you talked about, firearms that are used for hunting, and then you said others that were available for tactical purposes. What is the difference between a rifle or shotgun that's designed for a tactical purpose versus for common use in hunting in terms of the classification?
Well, there's no generally accepted definition that holistically defines a hunting rifle, but logically, a hunting rifle is one which is designed for the purposes of hunting. The design features can vary significantly depending on the kind of game that the hunting firearm is designed for use with. So, 22s and similar firearms would be suitable for very small game, and then a centerfire cartridge for hunting big game, for example, and a rifle that supports that. And then shotguns are generally used for hunting birds, although they can be used for big game hunting as well. Tactical firearms, on the other hand, are firearms which are, again, broadly speaking, there's no accurate, holistic definition of what is a tactical firearm, but broadly speaking, they're associated with military and police.
So what would they be used for then? What would a tactical? Just be very clear. We've talked about. We've said that hunting rifles were used for hunting game. What are tactical rifles or shotguns used for?
Well, they'd be used by police to assist with their obligations to enforce the laws, and it could be used against people or animals as the circumstances would dictate in a police or military operation.
So when manufacturers are developing or marketing firearms for our market here in Canada, do they take these classifications into account?
A manufacturer in general will design a firearm for sale to a particular segment of the market that they think would be interested in their firearm. So depending on what group of potential purchasers they're aiming for, they would design the firearm accordingly, and that's extremely varied. So the market is very much fragmented in that respect. There are all kinds of uses for firearms that fall into general use categories or specialty categories that a firearm manufacturer may be aiming for in the design of their firearm. So there's no general answer to that question.
I'm going to go back to what you were talking about in terms of, you used military operation, and then we talked about tactical a little bit. What is the difference between military and tactical? From in your expertise, what is the difference between military and tactical? Because these are terms that get thrown around a lot. And I just want to make sure we are all on the same page.
Yeah, there's not a hard black line you can draw between military and tactical. Military firearms, broadly speaking, are those which are designed for military use. So they would include large caliber armaments, so grenade launchers, rocket launchers, etc. The types of firearms that are mentioned in paragraph 95, I believe. The military firearms would also include fully automatic firearms, and military use would also include what I would loosely call tactical firearms. These would be firearms which are not fully automatic, but which fulfill a tactical role on the battlefield, such as sniping and other specialty purposes. The term tactical is often associated with police and security agencies that are not permitted to use fully automatic firearms, but use firearms that are similar in nature except for the automatic fire.
So previously you said that there wasn't a clear definition of tactical weapon, correct?
The definition will be mushy. It won't have hard borders to it because firearm manufacturing represents a continuum. So it's impossible to draw a line that cuts a continuum at an exact point and differentiates between two classes of firearms.
So you can appreciate that, you know, for many people, a mushy definition is unsatisfactory. I know that my friends across have been asking for some time, as if we, for some clarity around some of these things. If I understand correctly, do Bill C-21 amendments not actually start to give us something that looks like a definition?
Well, the use of words like tactical and military appear in the RIAS for the regulations of May 2020, but those words do not appear in any definition. I would suggest that they are more in the category of criteria that the Governor and Council used to select firearms that were put on the list.
So why is it hard? Why is it hard for us to get? And I'm going to use your term because I quite like it. Why is it hard for us to get anything beyond a mushy definition? Like what causes that to be the case? And this is a sincere question because I think for all of us here, we certainly do not have the depth of knowledge combined that all of you have. So why is it hard to define these things?
There are two reasons primarily. One is what I mentioned before, in that the firearms manufacturing design choices represent a continuum. So the firearms will have features that range from hunting to tactical, and you can add and subtract individual features on a firearm, and there's no really clearly defined point at which the addition of operating characteristics changes the firearm from a tactical to a non-tactical firearm. The second reason is that the firearms themselves can often be modified to switch from one category to another. So they can be equipped with features that are suitable for hunting, and then those features can be added and subtracted in order to produce a tactical firearm. So and that's the trend today in manufacturing, is towards the use of modular firearms, which can be transformed from one purpose to another simply by adding or subtracting components.
And just to clarify, transformed by whom? By the manufacturer or by anyone that chooses to buy those parts?
Historically, it was the choice of the manufacturer, or required the services of a gunsmith to change the firearm, typically. However, the trend for the past couple of decades, at least, has been for manufacturers to build firearms which are modular in nature and which are designed for the end user to change the features to transform the firearm from one purpose to another.
So I could get my gun license, I could get my PAL or my RPAL, I could then buy a weapon that is not used for tactical purposes, and then I could buy the components and in the privacy of my own home then turn that into a tactical weapon if I so choose.
In some cases, yes.
Why is that problematic for law enforcement?
You would have to consult someone from law enforcement on why they don't like that.
I'm sure some of my colleagues in law enforcement might want to jump in on that, but that's perhaps for a conversation later. I can understand that. As I look at it, you know, I can understand why that might be highly problematic, and I do think that this is, you know, part of why we are, you know, here having this conversation today. So, Mr. Smith, I'm going to give you a bit of a break, and I'm just going to switch back to Ms. Klushek and Ms. Clark. When you provide us this list, is it going to be organized in a way so that a reader, and I know this wasn't what I asked before, but, you know, given the work you've been doing, maybe you've already thought about this, is will people understand why each of these firearms is being banned? Will there be an explanation?
In the actual statute, because this will be codified in the criminal code, we don't normally, with criminal amendments, add in a rationale into the code. However, there will be the availability of the Hansards, the debates of this committee, parliamentary committee, and any background and information by the department. So there would be a bit of an explanation in terms of how it's meant to enhance public safety, et cetera, in our key messages through communications.
So will there, I guess what I'm trying to get is will there be a way for folks to understand if something is specifically listed or which criteria it meets, or is that going to be difficult for folks to get an answer to?
In terms of posting, so it's like any other criminal definition or part of the criminal code in terms of offenses. So no, there's no explanation in the code. It's a matter of reading the definition and being able to apply it to a specific fact situation. But my colleague might want to jump in on that.
I would just remind the committee that the evergreen definition and Schedule 2 would come into force by an order in council. And during that time, the Canadian Firearms Program would have an opportunity to review the firearms reference table to identify which firearms may be captured by the evergreen definition, and then that information could be communicated prior to the coming into force of these provisions that would prohibit the firearms.
Thank you. All right, Mr. Smith breaks over. Let's go back to the standard. Let's go back to the PAL and the RPAL. There's been a lot of discussion about this. I know there are many of us who want to know and want to understand what goes into that process. So what standards have to be met in order for someone to get a PAL or an RPAL?
Again, broadly speaking, because I don't have the details in front of me to go through it, atom by atom, but broadly speaking, the individual who wishes to get a firearms license today would be required to take a firearms safety training course and pass it successfully. And that safety training course involves both a written examination and a practical examination handling firearms. They would also be subject to a review by the chief firearms officer, who would vet their suitability for owning firearms, and the chief firearms officers would have access to various databases for that purpose. They're also free to contact the references that the firearms applicant has nominated to get a sense of the background or the history of the individual. And at that point, the chief firearms officer or the agent working for the chief firearms officer would then make an assessment as to whether the review has been thorough enough, and a license could either be issued or rejected based on what they know at that point, or whether further investigation is required, and a CFO is entitled to proceed with additional investigations if necessary. And at the end of the day, the chief firearms officer or CFO will make a decision on whether the individual can be granted a license or not. That decision is appealable to the courts, and then the court has the final say on whether the individual can get a license or not.
And once they have that license, how often is it reviewed and renewed?
A license is good for 5 years, and there is a renewal process which takes place. And again, the CFO typically looks at the intervening 5 years between licensing, but is presently entitled to go right back to day one if they so choose. So the ability of the CFO to go back in history, in time, to vet a potential firearms license renewal is not limited. And again, the CFO would go through a similar process of collecting information on the individual and making decisions at various stages as to whether they plan to accept or reject or investigate further.
Thank you. I would like to, if I could, just turn back to many of those Canadians who have heard a lot of discussion about how hunters will be impacted or could be impacted or are being convinced that they might be impacted by what is or is not in this legislation. Let's talk about firearm action for a moment. When we're talking about firearm action, what do we actually mean?
The action of a firearm is a descriptive term for the kind of mechanism it has. So, a bolt action, for example, refers to an action that operates like an ordinary door bolt, where a handle is moved to unlock the mechanism, and then the bolt is slid backwards and forwards to unload and reload the firearm. There are lever action firearms, where a lever, typically underneath the bottom of the firearm, is pushed down to open the mechanism and then raised to close it again. The semi-automatic action is one where much of the loading action is done automatically by the firearm. It's kind of like having an automatic transmission in a car versus a standard. It's just the same operations occur, but the firearm does it automatically for the user. And there are many types of actions, though those are some common ones.
We've heard a lot about bolt action. What about pump action? What about pump action?
Pump action is a mechanism where the fore end of the rifle or the shotgun, that's the handle of the firearm that's typically below the barrel at the front of the firearm, and it is moved backwards and forwards by the operator of the rifle or shotgun, and typically the backward stroke is what is used to unload the firearm or eject a fired cartridge, and the forward stroke is used to load a fresh cartridge to fire again. And it also falls into the category of a manually operated mechanism.
And what about hinge action?
What about which one, sir?
Hinge action.
Break open or
Yeah.
hinge action. Those can be found on rifles or shotguns and some handguns. And typically there, the firearm will have a pin and a hinge midway down the firearm, which allows the firearm to be opened like a clam, so to speak, for access to either unload or load the firearm.
So which firearm actions are legal for use in Canada and which are illegal?
Broadly speaking, the classification of a firearm does not depend on its action. The exception there is the fully automatic action, where any firearm with a fully automatic action is prohibited. But other than that category, the action really doesn't influence the classification, or not directly anyways. It can indirectly, but not directly.
Well, let's talk about the automatic actions for just a moment. Why are they prohibited?
Again, that's a choice made by Parliament, in this case back in 1978, was to prohibit fully automatic firearms. And I was in the business then, and my understanding was that the government of the day viewed fully automatic firearms as being possessed by individuals as being contrary to the good of public safety.
What would be the ordinary use for an automatic weapon?
Automatic firearms are designed primarily for military use.
They're used to kill people.
Yes, to kill people and cause damage.
Okay. So what does Amendment G4 set out to do in terms of actions? I mean, does it prohibit all semi-automatic firearms?
This is the amendment in G4
Yes.
you're referring to, sir? No, it will. as written, it would prohibit certain semi-automatics, that they must meet other conditions than being semi-automatic, but not all semi-automatics.
What are the other conditions?
G4 would require the firearm to be either a rifle or a shotgun. So that excludes handguns, for example. It would have to have a semi-automatic action. It would have to be chambered for a center fire caliber. So rimfires would be excluded. And it would have to be designed to accept a detachable magazine, which would exclude firearms with fixed magazines, for example. And the magazine it's designed to accept would have to have a capacity of more than 5 cartridges. So that would again exclude those firearms which have a detachable mag that contains 5 shots or less. And the last criterion is that when assessing the kind of magazine, it must be a magazine of a type that the firearm was originally designed to accept.
Just for clarity's sake, how many of those criteria does it need to meet to be prohibited?
All of the criteria I just mentioned.
I'm asking you this question because inevitably someone somewhere is going to clip the answer you gave when you said it has to be a shotgun or a rifle. And I just want to be abundantly clear. In order for anything that has been set out to be banned, it must meet those 4 or 5 criteria you identified, correct?
For the evergreening provision, yes.
Okay. I just want to make sure that your answer, the fulsome nature of the answer you gave, is not misinterpreted by others, as we have seen to be the case. So thank you. Now, we've talked about caliber. High level, what does the caliber of a bullet refer to?
Caliber has 2 meanings commonly used. The historical meaning, which referred simply to the diameter of the interior of the barrel of the firearm. So in other words, how wide a bullet that the firearm would accept. In modern parlance, with the advent of cartridge firing guns, the term caliber has been broadened to mean the name of the cartridge that a firearm is designed to use. So that could be in a standard caliber for a rifle, or it could be in a gauge for a shotgun.
And what are the different calibers that are available in Canada right now?
There are hundreds of calibers available, some more common than others.
Okay. What are some of the common ones?
Calibers that are commonly used are .308 Winchester, .223 Remington, for rifles, and for shotguns, 12 gauge and 20 gauge.
And how many of these would be affected by C-21?
Well, caliber does not factor as one of the criteria directly for either the schedules or the evergreening provision. It does have an indirect effect. Okay, and I'll deal with the schedules first. The firearms named in the schedules are all firearms, therefore they must have a caliber. That means that those particular calibers are affected to the extent that the firearms that use them are listed in the schedule. In the case of the evergreening provision, it's limited to centerfire calibers. So any firearm that's chambered for a rimfire caliber would not be affected by the evergreening provision.
So for those of us that are not hunters, and my friend Mr. Shipley has left the room, but he, I think, also mentioned that he was not a regular hunter. What caliber would most hunters, what is commonly used for hunting, say, deer?
The choice of caliber is highly dependent on the game animal being pursued, and is influenced by a variety of factors, which would include, without being exhaustive, which would include the nature of the federal and provincial hunting regulations, because they put limits on the calibers that can be used. It would also depend on the personal choices and preferences of the individual who is out hunting. The hunter generally will select a caliber and a firearm that uses it that the hunter believes will be humane and effective for the particular kind of game that they are pursuing. So to circle back to your question and what calibers are appropriate or which calibers are commonly used, that will vary highly depending on the kind of game animal. So if a hunter is hunting ducks and geese, for example, they're obliged by regulation to use a shotgun with a certain range of gauges. In the case of hunting big game animals, the hunting regulations, which are under provincial control and which do vary a little bit from one province to the next, will generally put limits on the kind of cartridge that can be used for hunting certain game animals. So, to give an example, wildlife regulations would not permit the use of a rimfire cartridge for hunting big game, as an example.
And what are the consequences of using a larger cartridge in terms of when the animal is ultimately killed?
By larger, I'm presuming you mean more energetic or
Yes.
closer to the 10,000 joule
Yes.
limit. The hunting literature in general describes an ideal energy level for each kind of game animal. However, that's generally not regulated by law, at least not in Canada. Other countries do that. In some ways, the provincial hunting regulations limit the energy by indirect means, that they won't allow a cartridge, for example, with a bullet smaller than a certain diameter, which indirectly affects the energy level of the cartridge. But as the energy level increases, generally the firearm becomes more suitable for hunting bigger game and less suitable for hunting smaller game. One, because a bullet that's too energetic may cause damage to the game animal to make it unsuitable for eating afterwards. Another relates to the personal comfort of the hunters. As the energy level goes up, so does the recoil, and owners, while opinions vary, owners will have certain ideas of how much recoil they're prepared to accept when they're out hunting. And lastly, the more energetic a projectile is, the further it will travel in general, and the more damage it will cause when it impacts. And so when you get into very high energy ranges, then the issue of the hunter being able to control where the bullet lands when they're out hunting becomes more problematic.
So going back, and there's a lot to unpack in what you've just said. So let's just take a step back. Of the common calibers that are used, how many of them would require a barrel that could fire in excess of, call it, 10,000 joules?
I'm not sure I understood the question. Could you repeat it, please?
So we talked about all of these different, when we were earlier talking, you mentioned the 223 Remington, you mentioned the 308. 10,000 joules. How many of those calibers would require a barrel that could fire in excess of 10,000 joules?
Well, the first of all, the barrel is designed to accept a particular caliber. So if you have a hunting rifle that is 308 Winchester caliber, that means the chamber inside the barrel is manufactured to accept 308 Winchester caliber ammunition, and only that ammunition. So there are some exceptions, but broadly speaking, a barrel is designed for a single caliber, and the choice of caliber will influence the kind of barrel that the firearm has. Does that address your question?
Yeah. So we know that there are weapons that can fire over 10,000 joules that were previously prohibited by the order and council.
Chair,
Like, what
Chair,
would?
just a point of clarification. I just wanted to get a clarification on that last line
course.
of questioning.
Go ahead,
if I
Mr.
may.
McGregor.
Can you explain to the committee just how, because this is important, how are joules measured in a firearm? Can you just broadly give the technical answer to that? Like, how is a joule measured, the number of joules that a firearm can produce measured?
Joules represents the energy level of the projectile. So it's basic physics. So it's just the amount of energy that energy of motion that a projectile has. As it applies to the prohibitions of paragraph 96, it is the muzzle energy that counts. So that's the energy of the projectile as the bullet leaves the muzzle of the firearm.
Can I ask, like, is it measured by mass of the projectile, the amount of gunpowder behind it, et cetera?
Joules is the measurement. So that's the quantity that's being measured. And that is a combination of the mass of the projectile and the speed of the projectile. So there's a formula that uses those two factors that will allow you to calculate the joules.
I'm a physics major. It's half the mass times the square of the velocity.
I just wanted it on the record. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for that clarification. We are all better off knowing that now. Look, we know that there, as I was asking before, we know that there are weapons that can fire above 10,000 joules that were previously prohibited by the Ordering Council. Like, what would commonly fire above that limit?
There are two broad categories of firearms that would be chambered for cartridges that develop 10,000 joules or more. One is military firearms. It's quite common for military firearms to be over that limit. The second would be rifles designed for hunting large game animals, such as African game, so elephants, rhinoceros, animals of that size. Will involve the use of firearms which are chambered for calibers around 10,000 joules. Now, they're not all over. There are calibers which are recognized as being elephant gun cartridges, if I can use a less precise term, some of which are over 10,000 joules and some of which are under 10,000 joules. But where you see that level of energy in a hunting application, it is for large African game in general.
Okay. So I'm trying to understand what use we would have in Canada for something that fired over 10,000 joules.
Well, what I can speak to is what they have been used for to the present. One is there are individuals in Canada who travel to Africa for hunting big game animals and who have their own rifle. They prefer to take their own rifle with them, so they own a rifle in Canada that's not routinely used for hunting in Canada, but is the firearm that they would take with them when they go somewhere else to hunt a game animal that requires that level of energy. The second broad use that occurs at present is very long range hunting or target shooting. So these are circumstances where there's an attempt to harvest game or hit a particular kind of target at distances of a kilometer or more.
Kilometer or more. So let's say I were to use, let's say I were to fire, I were to fire with 10,000 joules at 200 meters and I were to hit a deer. What would happen to that deer? If I were to hit it. I mean, I'm probably a terrible shot, but let's assume I were to hit. What would happen to that deer at 200 meters using 10,000 joules?
Well, there's a variety of factors that feed into that. One is it depends on where exactly you hit the deer. Assuming the bullet goes through the vital organs, then it's very likely the deer would be killed. There could be some destruction of the game meat, but that would be very dependent on the construction of the bullet. Some bullets are built very solidly because they're intended for penetrating deep into large animals like elephants, and so on a deer, the bullet would probably pass through the deer, not causing much more damage than you would expect from an ordinary hunting caliber, simply because of the construction of the bullet. So the answer to your question is highly dependent on the exact circumstances, so the exact caliber of high energy ammunition, the exact construction of the bullet, and where on the deer the bullet impacts.
But in this scenario, could I achieve the same objective using something materially less than 10,000 joules?
Yeah, it's generally accepted that a deer can be successfully harvested with a rifle that produces something in the range of 3,000 joules. You know, the recommendations vary somewhat. You know, a little more, a little less, but around the 3,000 joule mark is typical of where the hunting experts would recommend for a caliber that is intended to be used for hunting deer.
And using the 10,000 joule versus 3,000 joule example, how common is it for someone to use 10,000 joules versus something that fires 10,000 versus 3,000 in those scenarios?
The firearms in question are non-restricted, so there are no controls on the transport and use of those firearms for hunting. I'm not aware of any restrictions on the use of large calibers for hunting, although it's possible there is some regulation that is in the provincial domain that I'm not aware of.
You said something very interesting. You had many interesting things, but you said something that I'm a little bit curious about. You talked about the quality of the bullet. In the scenario we talked about, in shooting the solid and the nature of the bullet that was used. Are there rules about the kind of bullets that can be used?
There are, and those rules come in two forms. There are actual statute regulations, both federal and provincial, that will stipulate limitations on the kinds of projectiles that can be used. And then there are informal restrictions based on good practices in hunting that would drive the selection of one bullet over another for hunting a particular game animal.
Okay, so now let's get back to kind of clarifying some things, terms that we've used. What does chambering mean?
The chambering or the chambering of a firearm is referring to the design of the chamber, which is located inside the barrel of the firearm, typically, certainly for rifles and shotguns, and it refers to the physical dimensions of that chamber and the amount of pressure it is designed to withstand during discharge. And it determines the kind of ammunition that can be used in the firearm. So for example, a .308 Winchester caliber rifle that we spoke of earlier would have a chamber that is designed and manufactured for discharging .308 Winchester caliber ammunition. And the barrel has a chamber, but the caliber of the ammunition that it uses is referred to as the chambering, or chambered for, or chambered in. There's a variety of variations on how the language is used.
And just talking about the .308 Winchester cartridge for a second, how many joules would you need to fire that?
The exact number of joules depends on factors other than just the ammunition. It is affected by barrel length, for instance. But a .308 Winchester rifle, an ordinary hunting rifle, would generate somewhere around 3,000 joules, depending on the exact kind of ammunition that's being charged and the barrel length of the firearm.
And how big are these? How big is a cartridge for? How big is this .308 Winchester cartridge?
You can infer in most cases, you can infer the the size of the projectile in very general terms from the numerical portion of the caliber name. So 308 Winchester fires a bullet that is .308 inches in diameter.
Got it.
So
Okay.
a third of an inch, so that would be something on the order of, what, 8 millimeters?
Got it. And for the purposes of this discussion, anyone watching at home, can you just clarify the difference between a cartridge and a bullet?
Okay. A cartridge is a complete unit of ammunition. So it consists, in general, of 4 components. So you have a cartridge case, which is the overall container. You have the propellant powder, which is inside the cartridge case. You have a primer, generally at the rear of the cartridge case, which is what the firing pin strikes and which is used to initiate the discharge of the cartridge. And lastly, you have the bullet, which is at the front of the cartridge. It's seated in the mouth of the cartridge. When a typical hunting rifle is fired, the propellant powder will be consumed. The bullet will be launched from the muzzle of the firearm and travel downrange to strike the game animal. And the cartridge case and primer will remain inside the firearm, and it is ejected by the operator of the firearm.
So now, okay, that makes sense. I think we've all now got a good understanding of that. Now let's talk a little bit about cartridges in the context of military-style weapons, which we had talked about previously. How big are those cartridges? What do those look like?
They can vary enormously in size. The military has all manner of firearms that require cartridges of different sizes. So to give a few examples, the Canadian Armed Forces standard service rifle uses a cartridge called, in civilian terms, is called .223 Remington. The military name for that cartridge is 5.56 by 45 millimeter NATO, but it's essentially the same cartridge, but the military gives it a different name.
So materially larger than your Winchester.
And that's quite a small cartridge.
Okay.
And then a larger cartridge would be 50 caliber BMG. BMG stands for Browning machine gun. So that's a very large cartridge that exceeds 10,000 joules, and that is used in military sniper rifles and in machine guns.
So if we were to use these larger cartridges that we've just talked about to go deer hunting, going back to our deer scenario, 200 meters away, what would happen in that scenario to the deer?
Well, the answer is the same as before. It depends on the bullet that is loaded. If an individual were using military ammunition, that ammunition generally is made very solidly and is not designed to deform or expand on impact. And so it would go through a deer largely unchanged. It would just make a hole in the deer the size of the projectile. Now, some energy would be transferred from the bullet to the deer, which would cause tissue damage and would, in the case of a 50 BMG projectile striking a deer, would almost certainly be fatal to the deer. But the amount of damage to the deer would again depend on exactly where it hits and whether it hits a bone or it goes through soft tissue and so on. So it's highly variable.
My colleagues, I don't know if it was Mr. Motz or Mr. Shipley, made a comment that no self-respecting hunter would use, Mr. Wright, because we're not hunters, right? So Mr. Motz noted that no self-respecting hunter would use military-style cartridges. Is that a fair statement?
It's common to use military calibers. So 223 Remington and 308 Winchester and 30-aught Springfield, these are calibers that have been mentioned many times in our conversation here. Those are all originally military cartridges that have been adapted for use for hunting. What differentiates a military cartridge from a hunting cartridge is the kind of projectile that's installed. So a hunting bullet is designed to expand on impact and cause a humane kill of the animal, whereas a military cartridge, in general, is designed to penetrate to go through defensive armor, and also to conform with the Hague Conventions on the use of military ammunition.
So let's talk a little bit about magazine capacity. Can you tell us a little bit about the magazines that firearms hold generally and some of the variations?
First of all, many firearms do not have magazines. There are all kinds of firearms used for hunting and sporting activities, which are a single shot, or in the case of shotgun, single barrel or double barrel. So there's no magazine per se on a wide variety of firearms. For those firearms that are equipped with magazines, the magazine size historically for hunting firearms and of the type that are widely used in Canada would be somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 or 4 cartridges. Although larger mags were available. For military firearms, the sky's the limit for magazine size. They can make them as big as they want, as big as it's practical, and the military also makes use of belted ammunition, which has essentially an infinite length.
So talking about the average hunting firearm then would hold how many cartridges?
Well, again, there's no definition for a hunting rifle, so I can't give a categorical answer there. But there aren't any hunting applications I'm aware of that requires a magazine size of 20 or 30 cartridges. So the magazine size is self-limiting in the sense of what is useful for hunting. That said, in Canada right now, at the present time, the traditional hunting rifles will have magazine sizes around 3 or 4 shots, but there are exceptions, and that is where former military firearms have been reused for hunting purposes. So I'll use a classic example, the Lee Enfield bolt-action rifle from World War II. There were many tens of thousands of those firearms recycled after World War II for use as hunting rifles, and they have a 10-shot magazine. So it's possible to have a bigger magazine on a hunting rifle, but a hunter typically would not use that many cartridges.
So,
Chair, point of clarification.
or clarification?
There really is no such thing as point of clarification. As long as Mr. Nur Mohammed doesn't mind, go ahead.
I just wanted to make it clear there to the committee, and I think Mr. Smith can confirm this. We did ask this a couple weeks ago. In general, with some rare exceptions, it's since 1992, it's been against the law to have, for a long gun, a bigger than 5-round magazine.
The answer that's partly correct. Okay, so it's since 1993, and it applies to semi-automatic center-fire caliber rifles and shotguns, and there is a 5-shot maximum for an individual possessed magazine. However, for firearms with other actions, there is no limit on the magazine capacity.
There is no limit. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Rep. Go ahead.
Thank you. So just going back to the piece we were talking about, I have observed, Ms. DeMoff and I had the benefit of going to visit the Vancouver Police Department, who showed us how easy it was to modify some of these cartridges, some of these clips, rather, to hold more. I mean, what level of concern should we have in respect of being able to modify some of these things at home to be able to hold more rounds?
Well, the level of concern is a question of public policy, which again is in your domain. However, I was involved at the time in the creation of the magazine regulations, and the government policy of the day, as explained to me, was that the concern was to provide a quick and easy way for owners to come into compliance with the magazine regulations at the time the law changed, and as a result, the conversion methodology of magazines was not all that strict. So a magazine can be modified from an illegal capacity, or a prohibited capacity is a better term, to a non-prohibited capacity through the use of a pin or similar device, which it does in fact block the magazine, but it's not incredibly secure.
So now let's go back to cartridges used by hunters. How many cartridges would you say are needed for your average hunter, let's say moose or duck hunting?
It depends how good a shot the individual is, I suppose.
One, apparently.
The goal of a hunter, okay, and I mean, I've hunted in the past, so I'm generally familiar with the culture. The goal of a hunter is for a one-shot kill. That is what they strive to do. They're not interested in peppering the game animal with, lots of holes. So in the case of your moose or your deer, the ideal would be one shot. Now, that doesn't always occur. A hunter may be shooting at a running animal and require follow-up shots. There may be something happen at the time the hunter is shooting, and the bullet does not strike the animal in the desired location, and a follow-up shot is required. So it's not infeasible to suggest that that one, maybe two follow-up shots would be appropriate for big game hunting. I would say most hunters would probably agree that emptying a mag of 20 shots, if it were available to hunters, is probably not what they want to do. In the case of hunting birds, the regulations are very clear there. That for hunting ducks and geese, which is regulated by the Federal Migratory Game Birds Convention Act, the hunters are permitted 3 cartridges. That's it. So when a flock flies over, the hunter has 3 attempts to bring down 3 ducks or 3 geese, or as many as they can with the allotted 3 shots, and then they must stop and reload. For other game animals that are used, where a shotgun cartridge is used, the maximum number of cartridges will depend on the provincial hunting regulations. And typically that's somewhere around 5, but that may vary from one province to the next.
So,
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Ms. Dance, you want a point of order?
I do believe that the member asked an important question and received an important response, but Mr. Smith did not outline predatory animals who may charge hunters. I think that that's an important part of a hunting rifle that you left out, sir. So I think if you're going to be clear, it's important to mention the predatory animals, grizzlies, wild boars, polar bears. You didn't mention the utility of a firearm and how many bullets may be needed should you be charged by one of those, which hunters unfortunately do encounter. I believe you would agree with me. So I just think that you were making a very good point, but you left out a critical purpose of having a firearm with multiple cartridges.
Thank you, Ms. Dancho. Mr. Smith, you may certainly respond if you wish, and then back to Mr.
Certainly,
Norman.
if a hunter is engaged in hunting in an area where large predatory animals are a danger, the typical practice, and I've hunted bear myself, so is to have more than one person present with a firearm. You would not hunt alone under those circumstances, and that in general, the 5 shots that are permitted for a typical hunting rifle would ordinarily be sufficient under those circumstances.
thank you for that clarification. So, I think Ms. Dancer makes a good point. So in that scenario, you're saying that the 5 would be sufficient. Is that correct?
In general hunting practice, yes.
Okay.
Okay, but again, the choice of rifle, the choice of the cartridge, the choice of the magazine size are all subject to provincial and federal regulation and to preferences on the part of the hunter.
So then this might be a bit cheeky, but let's say you were to send me and Mr. Shipley out hunting and we needed more... Not doing it, right? Not doing it. But let's say, that's right. Let's say we got our license and the two of us decided we were going to go out hunting. And we were not able to take down. Let's say by some miracle this happened and the two of us were to go out and we were to need more than 5 cartridges to take down an animal. What would that say about our hunting skill? Let's assuming that the animal was not running.
Well, I don't think that's the situation that really arises.
Not that bad a guy.
That's the next political blind date show.
There you go. Sorry, everybody. It's been a long couple of hours.
If you don't want to comment on our hunting skill, that's fine. Okay, I understand. I get it.
In my experience, it's something that just doesn't occur.
Okay. So what laws are in place today to make sure that individuals cannot legally exceed the max cartridge capacity?
Well, the cartridge magazine regulations are a regulation made under the criminal code. And if an individual fails to heed those regulations, they are subject to criminal prosecution.
Point of clarification on that, Chair, if I may.
Once again, if it's okay with Mr. Nur Mohammed, go ahead.
And I won't be going on hunting with Talib anytime soon.
Why not?
Just
that's
for clarification, so what you're really trying to say in a political way is anything greater than a 5-round mag is prohibited already in law, correct? And on the application you just asked that question.
It's prohibited for certain kinds of firearms.
Right.
So it's not.
That's what Mr. Nur Mohammed is referring to. Those firearms that are prohibited from having greater than 5-round mags. Those mags are already prohibited in this country, correct?
Yes, if the firearm is a semi-automatic centerfire caliber rifle, for example, then the capacity for the magazines has been limited to 5 shots since 1993. However, for common hunting firearms use many other action types, so lever actions and bolt actions and so on, and the magazine size for those firearms is not limited at present.
What I was getting at is the question that Mr. Nur Mohammed asked was specific to the firearms of, that fit the definitions here. And the guns now that have a 5-round maximum magazine capacity, that magazine, if you have more than 5 rounds for that firearm, they're already prohibited in this country.
Again, I'm not sure exactly what kind of firearms you're referring to. Are you referring to the firearms in the schedules?
Yes, the ones that are already prohibited under law.
I think we're getting into debate here, so I'll let Mr. Nur Mohammed clarify if he wishes.
Talking about more than 5 rounds. We had gone to the Vancouver Police Department, again, Ms. DeMoff and I, and they'd showed us clips that held 30, 40 rounds, but that had actually been modified to only allow you to shoot 5 at a time. How easy is it to modify those to go back to being able to fire 30 shots?
It depends on how the magazine itself was modified, but the most common way of modifying magazines is to install a pin. And I'm using the word pin very large. It could be a pop rivet, it could be an actual pin, it could be a screw that's welded in. There's a variety of ways of putting in what would amount to a pin. They are relatively easy to remove. They can be simply drilled out, and the magazine in most cases will function normally at that point. And the hole in the side of the magazine does not impair its operation.
And why is that problematic? And why is that problematic?
Well, the law is intended to limit magazine capacity to 5 cartridges. And so if a magazine is modified to hold only 5 cartridges to be compliant with the law, is easily reversed back to its original state, then it would be relatively easy for someone to defeat the intent of that particular regulation.
Which would mean it's prohibited.
My apologies, sir, but when my microphone is on, I can't hear a thing you're saying.
Yeah, so that's also
What you're referring to.
He doesn't have.
That's okay. Mr. Nur Mohammed will clarify as he needs.
Okay. Okay, all right. So let's a few more. I'm running out of time here, and I have quite a few more things I'd like to ask you. So I'm hoping that this won't bleed into next meeting as well. But I'd like to talk a little bit about hunting licenses and what it takes to become a hunter in this country. It's like we've talked about a PAL, but there's I think a lot of misinformation. I think there's confusion about what sorts of licenses a Canadian hunter would need to be out in the woods. Like when Mr. Shipley and I decided we're going to go hunting. Take us through the process that you need to go through to legally hunt.
I can only speak to that very broadly because that's really out of my lane. But broadly speaking, hunters are required to take a course and to pass a test in order to get a hunting license. Very broadly speaking.
Okay. I received a couple of correspondences about black powder firearms. What gun? Can you describe to us what guns use black powder fire? Or what are black powder firearms? Excuse me.
Black powder is a generic term these days, and it refers to propellants that were used in historic firearms. So firearms before the existence of cartridges. So these are the muzzle-loading firearms that where the hunter or the shooter in general had to manually load the powder, which was a separate element of the loading process. So there ordinarily would be a small container, commonly called a powder horn, where a measured amount of the propellant powder would be poured into the bore of the firearm, and then the bullet would be manually seated, and then the ignition system would be primed, and then the firearm could be fired. So black powder is a very generic term referring in one sense to the original kind of propellant that was black in color. That was a chemical combination of saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal. So we're talking, Days of the Pirates type propellant powder. However, that term, being generic now, also refers to more modern formulations that don't involve the same chemical substances, but which perform in a similar way. And they're used almost exclusively in muzzle-loading firearms.
And how would how would these be affected by Bill C-21?
There would be no impact.
Sorry, I couldn't hear you. I'm sorry. How would, Mr. Smith? I'm sorry, I didn't hear your answer.
Broadly speaking, there would be no impact. I mean, it's theoretically possible that someone could make a muzzle-loading variant of an AR-15. It would be captured as a variant, but that's highly unlikely. So generally speaking, no, they would not be affected.
So folks at home that would have black powder firearms in the main they can rest easy.
Well, they're still subject to all the other rules and regulations for firearms, but this particular series of amendments that's before the committee would not impact muzzle-loading firearms in any significant fashion.
Switching gears a little bit, recognizing we don't have a lot of time left, I do want to get a couple of things out there that I think are important for folks to understand. Is we've heard terms like rimfire and centerfire. Those of us who have taken the time to understand this law, understand this legislation, understand what centerfire means and rimfire means, I think have a good understanding of why some things are banned and some things are not. Can you explain what these two terms mean?
Sure. The terms rimfire and centerfire refer to how a cartridge is constructed. In the case of centerfire ammunition, the primer is located in the center of the base of the cartridge, hence centerfire. And the primer consists of a small capsule of shock-sensitive explosive that is ignited when struck by the firing pin of the firearm. There's a small hole between the pocket that the primer sits in that connects it with the interior of the cartridge, which contains the propellant powder, so that when the cartridge is fired, the firing pin strikes the primer. The blow to the primer causes the propellant inside that to ignite, which produces a flame that goes through the small hole that's called a flash hole, connected to the interior of the cartridge case, which ignites the main powder charge, which then propels the bullet down the bore. In contrast, rimfire cartridges are manufactured with the shock-sensitive priming composition located in around the rim of the cartridge. And when the cartridge is fired, the firing pin crushes the priming composition between the two sides of the rim, which causes ignition, and after that it works the same as for centerfire.
So what kind of firearms would employ rimfire?
Cartridges are for practical reasons these days limited to the what are ordinarily called 22. So 22 long, short, long rifle, 22 Magnum, and perhaps a few other cartridges as well. There's a 17 caliber rimfire, for instance, but there's a handful of cartridges that are in common use today. Historically, there was a broad range of rimfire calibers, but today the market forces have compressed it to a relatively small number. And these are generally lower power cartridges. The reason being is that the design of the rimfire cartridge case is not as strong as a centerfire cartridge case and cannot withstand pressures as high. So the nature of the design limits the rimfire calibers to a relatively low energies.
And what about centerfire? What kind of guns would use centerfire?
Centerfire, there is no limit really. I mean, the centerfires range from very small calibers to huge military calibers.
So now just turning to schedules 1 and 2, are any of the new firearms that have not previously been prohibited rimfire firearms?
I believe you're referring to Schedule 2 and
Yes.
the new paragraphs 97 onwards. Yes, there are some rimfires mentioned in those sections.
Okay, and why would they be there?
The firearms that are in that list are based on the same criteria as the May 2020 list, except that the conditions of modern manufacture or modern design and large quantities present in Canada have been removed. Those criteria from May of 2020 do not draw a distinction between firearms that are chambered for rimfire calibers versus centerfire calibers. It's only happenstance that the 9 families prohibited in May of 2020 were all centerfire.
Okay. So what does that mean in common language?
It means that the selection of firearms for the new schedule, the paragraphs 97 onwards, are based on the characteristics of the firearm, of which the caliber is but one factor, and that a firearm may merit inclusion in the list even though it is chambered for a rimfire caliber.
So, Ms. Clark, then, as you... Sorry. I thought you were off the hook. So that as, Mr. Smith has been very generous with his wisdom, and he just talked a little bit about, the definition and how and why certain of these rimfires have ended up on the list. Going back to the list and going back to the list that we're hoping to see today, what is the degree of confidence and comfort that your team has that indeed everything on that list meet the criteria that were outlined by yourself?
I think it's probably a question to the Canadian Firearms Program. I think we have confidence that with that additional list in Schedule 2, it meets the main criteria from May 1st, which again was semi-auto, sustained rapid fire, military tactical design, capable of receiving a large capacity magazine. So we've used the exact same criteria that was given to us from May 1st The only difference in the Schedule 2 is the elements or the criteria of modern design has been removed, and the volume or prevalence in the Canadian market has also been removed. But essentially, the list was designed based on that same first criteria.
So in the main, if people were looking at that 2020 criteria and have made decisions accordingly, and the criteria that you mentioned a couple of additional criteria, but the fundamental nature of the criteria are exactly what was proposed and utilized in the OIC from 2.5 years ago, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. So I guess then I do then struggle with the idea that somehow this is something that's been much more conflated. But I think today has been, so far where we are in this conversation has been very, very useful. I think we have learned. Thank you, Mr. Motz. I appreciate that. Yes, I have learned, as I'm sure many of us have, and I've also learned that you're not going to go hunting with me and Mr. Shipley, and that's totally okay. I think it's important for us to have some of what you said. Many of us have taken the time to review and to learn, those that don't have the extensive experience that Mr. Motz does with firearms, to be able to learn through this process. But I think that what you've done today and what we may have to continue next week is to provide those that have been misinformed a little bit of the very important context that you have given us today. And I want to acknowledge, the Prime Minister and others have taken the effort to try and clarify some of this. We have said from the outset that we are committed to trying to improve this legislation.
Point of order, Mr. Chair, that's incorrect. From the outset, they said these were weapons of war that should be banned. Just to be clear, that's on the record from when it was introduced.
That's not a point of order, so we'll let Mr. Nur Mohammed finish. I'm going to have to cut you off very, very in seconds here in any case. So.
Okay, so as I have said, and despite what others may think, I know that I have come at this, and I have had this conversation with many on this committee. We are looking to make this good legislation even better. And there is an openness, a willingness, and a desire to ensure that not only do we hear from voices that may not have been heard, but also from others to work together to try and do this. This is being done to help keep Canadians safe, to ensure that hunters' rights are protected, to ensure farmers' rights are protected, to ensure that Indigenous communities are not affected, but most importantly, to ensure that we are keeping Canadian families safer. So, Mr. Chair, I know I'm probably running out of time.
You are
I'm
out
going
of
to
time.
pause and turn it back to you.
So thank you. We'll pause your time there. So I want to start by saying how much in awe I am of Mr. Smith's encyclopedic knowledge of firearms. It's thoroughly amazing. I don't know about you guys, but I think that we've kind of had a crash course in firearms. We could probably challenge the exam for a PAL ourselves after this. I don't know what the rules would allow that. Yeah. Anyway, thank you all for joining us once again today. And we will resume this debate on our next, when we next sit on clause by clause. And with that, we are adjourned.